You don't want to get arrested in Japan. One of the many great things about Japan is how extremely safe the country is. Crime rates in Japan are one of the lowest in the world, and they are magnitudes lower than in any other country of its size. But there is a high price for such low crime rates, and in Japan, it comes in the form of its legal system, which is one of the most harsh and unforgiving in the world, and which almost never lets go of people that it gets its hands on, whether they are actually guilty or not. The system is known as hostage justice, and it's the dark and deeply disturbing side of the safe and friendly Japan that you know. It's the reason why one of the world's most developed democracies has a higher conviction rate than most dictatorships, and why, once you're arrested in Japan, you're almost guaranteed to be found guilty. So, what happens if you're unlucky enough to get arrested? Why is almost every suspect automatically guilty? And why does this system even exist in the first place? This is the dark secret of Japan's hostage justice. But before we explain why the system works this way, let's take a look at exactly how it works. How is it even possible that everyone who is charged is found guilty? And what you might expect if you end up getting arrested in Japan? In 2018, Goone, a foreign executive of a major Japanese car manufacturer, was arrested in Japan on suspicion of fraud. He was held for weeks without a charge. He was denied contact with his lawyer, his family, and the outside world, being questioned for hours at a time without a lawyer present, and denied bail several times. A year after his arrest, he still didn't have a court date, and he could spend years before he would actually appear in court. Goone eventually ended up escaping from Japan hidden in a box, but in Western media, this high-profile case attracted a lot of attention to the Japanese legal system, and questions about how a justice system in a democratic country can even operate like that. But what happened to Goone actually happens on a daily basis. So first of all, what happened to Goone and what happens to almost anyone is that when you're arrested, you're not actually charged with anything. In the US and most of Europe, you can't be held without a charge for longer than a day, or maybe 2 in special cases. But in Japan, you can be kept in jail without being charged for up to 23 days, on suspicion of almost anything. Like in the case of an artist who modeled items, such as this kayak, based on a digital scan of her genitals, and who was promptly arrested on suspicion of distributing obscene material, and detained for over 3 weeks before being charged. In the UK, for example, you can only be held without a charge for up to 14 days if you're a suspect of terrorism. And even that is controversial. But in Japan, even a shoplifter can be held for 23 days. But it can actually last much longer. Yasutaka Sato was arrested on a suspicion of stock manipulation, and he was originally detained for 20 days. But immediately after he was released, he was arrested again. His alleged crime of manipulating the stock for 1 year was broken up into 6 different crimes of manipulating the stock for 2 months, for each of which he could be arrested again and again. And in fact, there is actually no limit on how many times a suspect can be re-arrested. And since all is needed is a suspicion, anyone can be theoretically held that way almost indefinitely. Yasutaka, who refused to admit guilt, actually ended up being detained for 14 months before finally being released on bail. Because almost every single crime can be arbitrarily broken up to an infinite number of smaller ones, the police can re-arrest people again and again, each time holding them for over 3 weeks. And so it often takes months before you are even charged with a crime. And while that is going on, you are left in isolation and in pretty harsh conditions, interrogated for hours and hours day after day, and often without the ability to contact your family, speak to your lawyer, or even get access to critical healthcare. But why do they do that? Well, whether you committed the crime or not, the desired outcome is that you confess, rather than to actually find the truth. That's what the system is made to do, and so in many ways, you're treated as if you already are guilty, even though theoretically you're just a suspect. While in the West, you are innocent until proven guilty, in Japan, you're guilty until proven innocent. And everything that happens is done so that you break. And if you're unable to speak to your family, get legal advice, or access to healthcare, and you're facing the prospect of spending years in prison without even seeing a judge, you might start to think that confessing, even to a crime that you didn't do, is the lesser of the two evils. And weirdly enough, it might be actually a rational decision for you to confess even to a crime that you didn't commit. Especially for less serious crimes, if you do confess, you can get out fairly quickly. But if you insist on your innocence, you might spend years behind bars just waiting for your trial. That's why the Japanese legal system is often called hitojichi shiho, or hostage justice. And it's the reason why the conviction rate is so incredibly high. A large number of those who are charged with a crime are forced to confess way before their case ever gets to court, by literally being held hostage by the legal system, with confessing to a crime being the only way to escape out of it. This system has been criticized by many human rights organizations, and even by the United Nations, which have called on Japan to change the system, and which have called the case of Carl Goone, mentioned in the beginning, fundamentally unfair, as it denied him his right for a fair trial. And even in Japan itself, the system is often criticized, and it's quite controversial. And there is a major lawsuit going on against the government, claiming that the hostage system itself is illegal. But that's just one part of the question, because if you now know how the system works, and that something seems to be very wrong with it, you have to ask, why does this system even exist? And why does a country like Japan, with a strong and well-functioning democracy, operate in a way that you would expect from the harshest dictatorships? Well, while it might seem that the system exists because people involved are just being arbitrarily cruel or corrupt, the real reason is different, and it has a lot more to do with several concepts and traits that are inherent to Japanese culture, and how its institutions operate, and that, in the end, influence why the legal system works the way it does. The thing is that one of the most important aspects of the Japanese society is the concept of mensu, or public face. How you're being perceived by others, and whether your reputation and position in front of them remains intact. To an extent, this exists in the West as well, but in Japan, it's incomparably more important and much more formalized. Specific behaviors and situations are linked to saving or losing a face. Maintaining your public face at all costs is paramount, and this influences how people, especially in formal settings, like in a workplace, behave and treat each other. Disagreeing with someone in public, for example, would mean to make them lose face and expose them to a profound embarrassment. And so it's just one of the things that you don't do, and especially when that someone is in a higher position. That's in many ways the opposite of the West, where disagreeing with someone is not necessarily seen as a sign of disrespect, and telling like it is often seen as a good thing. But in Japan, it's not. And here's why this matters for the Japanese legal system. Let's say that you are arrested, charged, and because you are exceptionally stubborn, and after spending months or years behind bars, you still refuse to confess, you are eventually brought in front of a court. The court most likely has a panel of judges, because unlike in the US or the UK, courts in Japan don't have juries. But even if you really didn't do it, and you might have strong evidence backing you, the cards will be stacked against you from the beginning. Because in order for the judges to decide that you are not guilty, they would have to disagree with the prosecutor who brought the case against you in front of them. By declaring that you are not guilty, they would be making him lose his face, saying that he hasn't done his job properly, and even saying that the entire Japanese legal system has failed. And in a society where saving face is such a strong motivating force, that doesn't really happen, especially since the prosecutor is in a respected position, and he's part of the legal system, whereas you are just a random suspect that no one cares about. And then it becomes a circular logic. Everyone who is arrested is found guilty, and so if someone is arrested, it means they must be guilty, because, well, they were arrested. And so not guilty verdicts are exceptionally rare, and they happen in about 0.2% of cases. And if you want to appeal against the verdict because you think it's unfair, or because you know that you are innocent, that doesn't doesn't really work either, because in order for an appeal to a higher instance to work, a judge would have to publicly declare that other judges before him were wrong, and that would once again be a face-losing moment for everyone. And so, successful appeals are virtually non-existent. And that's why the whole system is set up to avoid all those uncomfortable disagreements. That's why the police are trying to get you to confess by, well, taking you hostage, whether you committed the crime or not. Why prosecutors are aggressively looking for plea deals, so that the cases don't have to go to court. And why, for the few people who actually get to the courtroom without confessing, the verdict is basically already decided anyway. But what does this say about Japan? And is it even a democracy with a system like this in place? Well, you can say that the system is not effective, since Japan is undeniably a safe country with very limited crime. But it's a system that's just not very fair or just. Although it is impossible to say exactly and with certainty, many convicts are likely wrongly convicted, just because the system doesn't accept mistakes or disagreements. At the end of the day, Japan still is a democracy, but not a Western one. And the justice system is just one of the many examples of just how different Japan is.